Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ecological Forestry in the context of climate change. Today, we have a treat for you. We have Deputy Regional Forester for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Southern Region, Haven Barnhill, and he's going to be talking about ecological silviculture to create wildlife habitat in Southern Bottomland Hardwood systems. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gwyneth Daunton at NCTC to get us started. Thanks, Gwyneth.
Hello, everyone, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center here in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and today's webinar is Ecological Silviculture for Southern Bottomland Hardwood Ecosystems by Haven Barnhill, who's actually an instructor for our forest ecology course in September. We have one spot left, so if that interests you, let me know and I can give you more information. Anyways, so we are very excited to have Haven on, and we'll be introducing him a bit more later, but just to make sure that your audio settings are proper, we do have closed captioning available and everyone is muted, but we would like people to introduce themselves, so you can do so in the chat. It did change. Cool. All right. So the National Conservation Training Center, we would like to start with our land acknowledgement. And so the National Conservation Training Center is located on the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous people who include, but are not limited to, the Massawomack, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. NCTC is dedicated to building relationships with these Indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn about the lands that we reside in. If you are interested in learning more about where you live and work, please let me know and I can share a link with you so you can learn more about who used to live on your land. We also would like to mention that NCTC welcomes all students. It is my intention to create a safe and inclusive and productive webinar environment that honors and supports diverse ideas. We are strengthened by the diverse perspectives and identities that we will foster in an environment where everyone can learn new skills. As such, I will be an ally in the event that anyone experiences access issues or feels unwelcomed. Feel free to message me in the chat. And we also, for those popping on, we do have closed captioning available, and we also have sign language interpreters as well on the call. And I'll help you figure out how you can view them in a second. A quick disclaimer, all of the products are for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior. Some of the materials or images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted due to their use. Mentions of any product name, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references do not imply federal endorsement. As I mentioned before, you guys are all muted, but feel free to message in the chat, like who you are, where you're located. Also, we very much so encourage you to ask questions. We will be stopping both halfway through the webinar to ask a couple questions to Haven, and then also at the end as well, but we will hope to get done on time. Also, make sure when you are submitting questions that you submit it to everyone, not just the panelists. Last but not least, so you can have the best viewing experience, especially if you want to see the interpreters, I would highly suggest going to side-by-side gallery, which is where you can see the presentation and then all of the people on the other side of the screen, like Haven and also our interpreters. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Gwyneth. My name is Jeff Horan. I'm a forest ecologist previously with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I've since retired, but I love this webinar series, and we have been able to have some really great speakers, and we have great participants. It's fun to see the chat unroll with people from all over the country and even beyond sometimes. So thanks for being great participants. That helps us make this series possible. So again, this series was put together by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Forest Ecology Working Group, and we have other programs like Science Applications, Migratory Birds, and particularly the National Conservation Training Center have been really important in getting this series going. But we've also had a great partnership with USDA Northern Forest Climate Hubs and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, which are both part of the USDA Forest Service, in sponsoring this webinar series. It has been a great partnership, and we've had a lot of fun putting the series together. You can see the webinar context on your screen. And if you need credits, CEU credits from either the Wildlife Society or SAF, you can contact Jim Siegel, and his information is right there. So thank you for that. Gwyneth, go ahead. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last few series, these have been 12-part monthly webinar series, and each of them tell a story. In this case, it's about how small and large scale forest disturbances, such as fire, wind, ice, hurricanes, sea level rise, flooding, also introduced and endemic forest pests, how they impact forest ecosystems. And this series also examines how we adapt ecological silviculture and climate adaptation approaches to help us inform our forest and wildlife decisions in the field. So I also, while we have a chance here, I want to do a quick commercial for our upcoming webinar series, our upcoming webinar, which is next month. What is the date for that, Gwyneth? Do you have it?
It's a great question.
We'll come back with that in a second. So we have Klaus Putman with Oregon State University, and he's going to be talking about ecological silviculture for Douglas fir, Western hemlock forest. So we're looking forward to that. He's a great speaker.
On July 16th.
All right, July 16th. Thanks so much, Gwyneth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so last slide, I can introduce Haven. So here we go. So our speaker today is Deputy Regional Forester Haven Barnhill. He's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the refuge system in our Southeast region. And I'm really looking forward to this because Haven and I have worked together a lot. He has a BS in wildlife and fisheries, and he also has an MS in forest management, which really is a great fit for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. His career focus has been on managing habitat to meet conservation objectives, and for the past 15 years, his focus has been on National Wildlife Refuge forest habitat management. And Haven has a breadth of experience. So he previously spent 20 years as a wildlife biologist in various state and federal agencies. So Haven has been around the barn a couple times. But I also have had a chance to work with Haven because he was one of the founding members of our Forest Ecology Working Group within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that is the group that really has created, sponsored, and put time and energy into this series. So Haven, thanks so much for joining us, and really looking forward to your presentation on bottomland hardwood systems. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff, so much for the introduction, and a big thanks to all the partners who have made this webinar series possible. I'm gonna see if I can share my screen.
Let me stop sharing mine.
Okay.
There you go.
Just see how this works. Hopefully that's going to work there.
Looks good.
Excellent. Well, I think a lot of the prior speakers in this series have been some of the foremost ecologists and the leading scientists that in this field. And my perspective today is going to be a little bit different. I consider myself kind of a simple practicing biologist and forester. I take the kinds of great information that others in this series have been providing and try to put it on the ground. Additionally, I'd be really remiss if I didn't acknowledge the team of colleagues in the Southeast region, the other foresters for whom I've learned so much, and throughout the presentation, I'll talk a lot about what we do. When the truth is, it's great foresters in the field whom are leading our efforts to provide important wildlife habitats. So with that, a fair amount I want to cover today. And so I'm going to move pretty fast. I'm going to try to introduce bottomland hardwood forest ecology, particularly the disturbances and stressors that shape this landscape. And I'm going to talk a bit about how it's been altered, and it has been substantially altered. Very different composition, structure, and in my opinion, function than what historically occurred. And then I'll share some examples of how we use ecological forestry to support our wildlife conservation objectives. And with that, we'll get started. There's been a lot of other speakers go into great detail about what ecological forestry is. So I'm going to not go into much detail, encourage you to look back on some of the other webinars for specifics. But when I think about ecological silviculture, I'm kind of thinking about what nature naturally does to do integrated management. What happens on the ground? It certainly incorporates the principles of natural forest and development, including the role of disturbances in the initiation and the development and the maintenance of forest. But I would offer that for bottomland hardwood systems that have been highly altered and degraded, the focus may not be as much on what once occurred as to perhaps a new normal, what can occur now and into the future. Even so, a lot of the same broad concepts apply. There'll be we manage for a continuity of structure, function, and biota across forest generations, pre and post harvest. And this is done by the abundant legacy that we leave on site. We promote stand level structural and complexity and diversity. And we think this is really important to supporting our agency's priorities for biological diversity, integrity, and environmental health across refuges. Certainly what we do, it's not, decisions are not just made at the local level, but we try to incorporate landscape priorities. And I'll give some examples today about landscape considerations that help inform our management in bottomland systems. And last, there's an important temporal context that disturbances, what we do to emulate natural disturbances, needs to occur at appropriate intervals to allow for recovery between treatments. And I think this one is a little bit more difficult for me to get my hands around, but we're going to cover that a little bit as well. So when we talk about bottomland hardwoods, we're referring to the major forest type that occurs in floodplains across the southeastern and into the Midwestern United States, as depicted on the map on the left. The term also describes the dominant forest trees that are associated with this ecosystem. And for today's talk, I'm going to talk extensively about the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. It's by far and away the largest floodplain in the United States. But I do believe strongly that the concepts that I'm going to discuss broadly apply to bottomlands across the Southeast. The Mississippi Alluvial Valley is massive, roughly a 25 million acre floodplain. About 40% of the mainland United States drains into and through the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, is depicted on the map on the bottom left of the screen. Traditionally, most of the water volume in the river originates from the eastern half of the system, and most of the sediment inputs originate from the western half of the system. The rich prairie lands have fed this system for a long time. The map on the right shows the general area that we're going to be discussing today. Most of this system has been highly altered. About 80% of the forest land was lost to conversion, mostly to agriculture. The dark green on this map highlights the remaining forest patches. Depending on whose estimate you use, it's roughly 7 or 8 million acres of forest land remaining, highly fragmented in over 33,000 blocks. The deforestation that has occurred in this valley hasn't been uniform across the site. It's been disproportionately occurring from the drier sites having been first deforested, and what remains are the wetter sites, places that are more subject to flooding, less conducive to agricultural lands. I'll talk today a fair bit about lands in the White and Cache River area, White and Cache River National Wildlife Refuge, and also some of our lands in Louisiana. I'll share some examples from there. I do want to point out on this map, the dark green, the abundance of forest land in the extreme southern portion of the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. If you'll note that within 100 or 150 miles of the coast, there's relative to the rest of the system, there remains a fair amount of forest land. Of course, much of this is wetter sites, but when we talk about wind disturbance, keep this in mind in terms of the resiliency of this ecosystem in changing wind disturbances. And in a previous webinar, Dr. McComb did an excellent job of talking about disturbances and stressors. Disturbances are discrete events that change the composition, structure, or biomass on a site, whereas the stressor is a continuous pressure that causes a site or part of a site to move into a new but different state and remain there. And they are different, but they also can be very similar or have some overlap. In I'll share some examples of that. For example, water. Water is a primary disturbance factor in bottomland hardwood forest in general. It can also be a stressor. Disturbances that we've caused on the landscapes can cause increased wetting or drying of certain areas, and over time, this certainly can change the composition and structure on a site. The map in the center was created about 80 years ago by Harold Fisk, and it shows how the river has changed over time. And one of the important points, and when you think about disturbance in a bottomland, is that it's very, very dynamic. These rivers are always moving across the floodplain. And the image on the right kind of is an animation showing how the river has substantially changed its course over about 4,000 years. Now, that's an animation. It's not exact, but it emphasizes the point that there's been major hydrologic changes over time. About once every 1,000 years, there's been a major change in the course of the river. And then the image on the left is of the Great Flood in the Mississippi from 1927, when about 14.7 million acres was flooded. It was the most devastating flood in America's history, and the impacts and from that flood in our response over time has had major impacts on the forest conditions that we manage today. So wind is another disturbance, a major significant disturber in our southern forest. Can be small wind events from breaking a branch out of a tree or disturbing a couple of trees to major events having significant impacts over a broad landscape, something like a hurricane. Relative to the big events, we know that in recent history, hurricanes are becoming more frequent and more intense and more numerous, as seen on the graph, the left side of the graph. And climatologists project that that's going to continue to happen. If you think back to the fact that much of the remaining forest land in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, the bottomland forest conditions are near the coast, certainly the increasing wind disturbance could change the structure and composition of the remaining forest. At least the risk may be higher for that. Also relative to tropical events, climatologists suggest that we're going to have more variable precipitation patterns, extended droughts, more severe rain events. Perhaps some of this will be associated with tropical systems, and that could have an impact on the timing of flooding in our bottomland forest systems. Certainly, we see more tropical events occur in the summer and fall, the fall being the driest time of the year for us in the Southeast. Historically, fire was a major disturbance in the ecosystem. Indians occupied, or Native Americans occupied the Mississippi alluvial valley for more than 5,000 years. They extensively cleared lands and frequently burned. But certainly much of the higher terraced lands, the drier lands that would have been a bit more adapted to periodic or frequent fire systems like white oak hickory or communities like white oak hickory, they were cleared first, and so less of that remains. But there's a little bit. The picture on the left side of the screen is from a WMA in Arkansas, where they have done some variable retention harvesting and reintroduce fire and are having positive responses in terms of structure composition and habitat quality from a biologist perspective. I think indicative of the amount of disturbance, particularly fire, that historically occurred were the records of the extensive cane breaks that occurred across the southeastern floodplain system and other areas, but particularly floodplain systems. Early European travelers talked about how vast and dense the cane thickets were. Bartram talked about traveling through 20 miles of dense cane in Alabama and 8 or 9 miles of cane forest in Mississippi, and this was a result of frequent disturbance, particularly fire. And very little of that system remains. Very little fire now occurs in bottomland forest throughout the Southeast. Of course, the biotic and abiotic interactions are normal components of stand development processes. However, when a highly altered landscape like we see in some of the Mississippi alluvial valley, the impacts can be disproportionate to their historical impacts. For example, the abundant farmland that used to be forest has resulted in a change in runoff. When the entire delta was a forest, it was a big sponge. It regulated the flow of water and also purified the water. Now you have runoff from every single field in the Mississippi Delta seems to be ditched and and drain straight into the valley, and the timing of the water inflows, it's a little different. Now we see beavers very, very widespread across some of our refuges. As an example, on Cache and White River refuges, it's combined, they're roughly 250,000 acres. So there's substantial bottomland hardwood forest. And between the two areas, our foresters report that beavers annually flood somewhere between 40 and 55,000 acres of forest. And 55,000 acres is 22% of that entire forest. And it has the potential to be a very substantial disturbance. And we do extensive beaver dam removal to reduce the impacts. Invasives are an increasing issue in the southeast. Emerald ash borer, invasive pest. Folks in the northeast and Midwest have been dealing with this for quite some time. It's relatively new to us, but it's going to cause very significant changes in our forest composition. And we'll talk a little bit about the general composition and what may happen over time. And the picture on the right is from one of our refuges where in Arkansas, Cache River Refuge, where we are seeing significant mortality from emerald ash borer. Certainly other invasives, Chinese tallow tree is an increasing problem. It's found in highest densities along the coast, but each year it migrates a little further north. It roughly moving 12 or 15 miles a year. It can grow in very, very, very dense thickets to where it impedes native vegetation regeneration and development. So it's a major problem in some of our bottomland forest systems. And something that anytime we do forest management, we need to consider implications from invasive species. Likewise, feral swines and other species that's widespread and detrimental to our forest system. It directly competes with native wildlife for food resources. It's omnivore, certainly feeds on invertebrates and herbs. The rooting behavior destroys with forest regeneration, increases sedimentation and erosion, quite problematic in our bottomland systems. So a bit about altered ecosystem function. From the mid-1980s, much of our forest was exploited as lands were developed. I'm sorry, from the mid-1880s, if I said 1980s. Anyway, much of the forest was historically exploited, and it was a little bit disproportionate in terms of what was being used. The higher value products were removed, things that were of most demand. Bald cypress and oaks were particularly useful, and what remained over time were forests that were more prevalent with shade-tolerant species that were also often of lower commercial value in many areas. I mentioned the Great Flood of 1927 earlier. That resulted in legislation to regulate the impacts of flooding, and over time it resulted in extensive changes to the bottomland system in the Mississippi alluvial valley. So roughly 3,500 miles of levees have been built in this system. Basically separating much of the forest floodplain from the river. And so what was a functioning ecosystem has now become disjunct from its primary driver. Of course, land conversion Most of the land conversion was for agriculture. About half of the forest lands were lost prior to the 1930s, and between the 1930s and the 1980s, the other half of the forest was lost. That kind of coincided with the increase in commodity prices and the high demand for products like soybeans. And of course, upstream, we're seeing significant impacts from dams and altered water management from the dam owners, like the Corps of Engineers. And as a kind of an example, on the White River Refuge, in the 1960s, refuge staff selectively harvested timber from across 110,000 acres over a 7-year time period. That was roughly 15,000 acres a year. And it wasn't a particularly dry time period. It was just normal. And thinking back for the last dozen or so years, I don't think there's been but 2 years where we were able to get into much of the forest on the White River Refuge to even consider active forest management until after July the 4th. The downstream flows from the dam were quite high, and it wasn't a particularly wet decade then either. Just that it was being maintained at an artificially high level relative to historic conditions. These flooding conditions are having a significant impact on structure and composition on some areas. I'm sure everybody's seen at one time or another a cross-section diagram similar to this one that shows the topographic variation of the habitat, the forest in a floodplain forest. And the specifics aren't necessarily important today so much as to recognize that even the minor variations can cause substantial changes to forest communities. There's species associations that are adapted to the bar or the front or levee area of a floodplain. There are other species specifically adapted to the swamp component or the sloughs. So knowing where you are and relative to the current hydrology in that system is quite important when we can think about our management decisions and restoration opportunities. And when you think about our forest in terms of hydrology, swamp forest, things like cypress and tupelo, and the wetter forest that may include overcup oak or bitter pecan. They're relative to historic abundance. They're much more abundant because these lands were much more frequently flooded. The drier bottomland forest communities are much less abundant than they once were. So we need to make sure when we think about restoration and management, we are promoting communities appropriate for the sites for which we're managing. Quickly on landscape context and considerations for landscape context, the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture Consortium in 2007 developed some guidance for wildlife-friendly forestry, how to restore and manage bottomland forests to benefit wildlife. And it's currently being revised, but in that guide, they identified some landscape metrics that we should strive for. High percentage of forest cover, 70 to 100%. Much of the forest should be actively managed. Passive management is important, and somewhere between 5 and 30% should be passively managed, but the majority of it should be actively managed. And within the actively managed area, some of the traditional practices, the large-scale clear cutting that for forest regeneration should be limited to less than 10%. We should look at different strategies for improving the complexity and diversity within our forest. And shrub composition should be less than 5%. So we've got these landscape parameters that can help guide us on some local decisions based upon what's going on more broadly around our areas. Forest is an important concept. It's extremely important for area-sensitive forest interior bird species, and our agency has a high priority on bird conservation. We know that a core forest, basically lands that are inside of that are more than 250 meters away from hostile environments. And that would be environments like pasture or other ag lands or developed lands. These core lands are quite important for wildlife, but when you really look at how fragmented the LMB landscape is, there's less than 2.6 million acres of core forest land remaining. And so this creates a conservation challenge on our landscape. It's also an opportunity, where we can increase the amount of core forest lands, a great opportunity, but it's a challenge in the sense that in that reduced community, we're trying to provide for a broad range of different species with different niches or habitat requirements. Everything from early species needing early cereal stage habitats to species needing old forest conditions. And so it makes it difficult to find an appropriate balance in terms of the temporal and spatial treatments for which we apply our forest management. Another way that we look at landscape conservation is trying to meet some specific bird conservation objectives. And this example is from some work that Dr. Dan Tweet with USGS did some years ago, looking at the contribution that forest lands can have towards species population objectives. We know that for species like Swainson's warbler needs a dense understory. We need about 10,000 acres to have a viable population, source, not a sink population. For cerulean warblers, the species requires some large trees with a complex canopy structure. We need closer to 20,000 acres. And then for something like a swallowtail kite, it wants some big super emergent trees for nesting and some open areas for foraging. It needs a large landscape, 100,000 acres. And so we can begin to model what we can contribute to conservation objectives on our current lands. And this can also help us identify where we could enhance or protect other lands that could help increase our contributions towards certain migratory bird population objectives. And before we take a quick question and answer break, I want to talk about the current composition of forest in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. It's a pretty diverse forest system. I can't recall the total number of species, but somewhere certainly over 100 tree species. And the most abundant is red maple. It's a species of highly tolerant of both shade and flooding. Sweet gum, I'll mention sweet gum in the sense that it's an important commercial tree and a good wildlife tree. It's a shade intolerant species, and we've seen from FA report that smaller diameter sweet gum is underrepresented. And this simply tells us that as the big sweet gum is either harvested or dies off the landscape, we do not have smaller sweet gum to replace it. Similar situation for red oaks. Uh, we know that red oaks are another shade intolerant species. We know from forest inventory and analysis data from the 1930s that roughly 50 to 53% of the forest composition was red oaks. Now it's less than a third of the forest composition. Couple of important points to point out. We talked about emerald ash borer. Green ash is massively important in our bottomland forest ecosystem. It's the fourth most abundant tree. 225 million stems in these bottomland forests, and they're going to die. EAB, it's going to kill them all, and so we're going to see substantial changes. And this is going to probably happen faster than some of us had anticipated. I know when we first learned of emerald ash borer on one of our refuges, the 7 years ago, the change in 6 or 7 years, it's been pretty stark, and I'll show some pictures of that in just a bit. A couple other things to point out. Loblolly pine, a common tree in the system. It's only this common because of plantation management. I also mentioned Chinese tallow, the invasive, very, very common. It's something that's going to be an ongoing problem for us when we try to either restore or manage bottomland systems. And lastly, sugarberry, the third most abundant tree in this system. There's some areas where, like the Cache Run, where I was working there last week, and we're experiencing a very significant sugarberry decline on that area. Not exactly sure why, but some of the stands we were in, we were seeing 50% or more mortality, and so it's right now between emerald ash borer and something going on with sugarberry, we're seeing a massive change in the structure of our forest. And with that, maybe Jeff, if there's a quick question or two.
There are. So the first question, and Haven, thanks. You have I have lots of questions, but I'll try to keep it mostly to the questions that are coming in. So one from Gerald, and this is very specific to Gerald is asking, is the Congaree National Park in South Carolina, which is kind of southeast of Columbia, is that an example of the type of bottomland forest that you're talking about? I think you're familiar with the area.
It is certainly a well-known bottomland forest. So, yeah, absolutely. It's also a forest that's been impacted by altered hydrology. Multiple dams upstream of the Congaree Park have changed that system over time, and how the river has moved across that system. Certainly a lot of invasives are impacting that system. I grew up very near there, and I'm quite familiar with it. A tremendous area. And it's an area where it's one of the few areas where we see substantial patches of older growth forest in bottomland systems. Most of it was previously cut. So it's a great example of old trees.
All right, so Haven, here's there's a couple more things I know you're going to get into, and one is kind of what's going to replace, and what do we do to replace, what do we do to have the species we want to have in the future, and I think you're going to talk about that in a minute. So I'm going to go back and ask a question that related to our Fish and Wildlife Service forests. We have in the Northeast, about more than 2/3 of our forests were bottomland and wetland forested systems. And so I often hear from folks, well, why do we want to manage these systems? Why isn't the management objective in those systems to hold those bottomland forests as reserves, since they can be, again, there are disturbance regimes in place. Why do we need to manage those systems? And again, I know you have lots of bottomland hardwood forests in the Southeast. And again, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service tends to get a lot more of these forests. So I'll let you chew on that one
So-
and answer.
So we do need to retain some forest in reserve across a lot of different types, including bottomland hardwoods. I certainly agree with that. But we also, as an agency, have a responsibility for managing a lot of priority resources of concern that utilize bottomland hardwood forest. And where we have highly altered systems and where we have deficiencies in habitat for those species, we have an obligation to try to address that just like we would any other species. It's a forest, but it's not atypical from what we do in land management for grasslands or upland forest or other coastal habitats. We try to provide the specific habitat conditions necessary for our conservation resources of concern. Protecting, just walking away and allowing the forest to change, it's still going to be a forest, but it's going to be different in its ability to meet our conservation challenges. And I think the other really, really important point relative to that question is when you think about a system like the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, where there's so little of the original forest remaining, roughly 60% of the species, migratory bird species that in the United States either nest over winter or migrate through that lower Mississippi Valley. We have species that need, like Swainson's warblers, they need dense shrub. We have species that need old forest condition. We can use silviculture to best emulate those conditions and create the structure and the composition that those species benefit from. And the data is clear. We've treated stands and we've monitored birds and great response. It's ephemeral, it's eventually the forest is going to succeed into something different. And that's a potential trigger for when we need to re-enter a stand and do something again.
Thanks for that, Haven. So I won't interrupt you anymore. There's a couple other good questions in here, but we'll get to them at the end.
Excellent. So I'm going to transition from kind of the landscape stuff and talk a little bit about stand level management and how we implement it. I'm going to go fairly fast here, but I will say that the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture led a consortium to develop recommendations on what we believe to be, what we know to be actually good structural components for wildlife habitat. They're currently updating this. I was hoping it would be published before this presentation, but it hasn't been yet. So hopefully later this year it'll be out. And within that, they identified some primary management factors that are beneficial for wildlife. These would be things like overstory canopy cover that would be roughly 60 to 70%. Currently, right now, many of our forests have a very, very dense canopy cover, and so very little sunlight penetrates to the ground level to stimulate development of mid-story and understory plants. There are mid-story objectives, roughly 30 to 40% of the forest canopy cover should be mid-story. And basal area objective. Basal area is a pretty easy forestry metric to measure and calculate, and roughly 60 to 70% of the maximum basal area would be a target for a desired wildlife habitat. Some other factors, secondary factors that should be considered and incorporated in managing for desired conditions include maintaining some dominant trees, having abundant understory canopy cover, that's a 25 to 40%, having a lot of shade intolerant regeneration. Up to 40% of the area should be in shade intolerant regeneration. And importantly, this should be highly variable. It should not be uniform across a stand. We're looking for a high degree of variability within a stand, where you have some areas that are more open and some areas that are more dense. Of course, maintaining older trees, legacy trees, and some stressed and dead trees, snags, are very, very important considerations as well. From a wildlife standpoint, many of the features that we look for are associated with the complete forest, sunlight getting through the forest, and deadwood associated with the forest. Things like snags, trees with small, medium, and large cavities, used by a wide variety of wildlife. Trees with large cavities suitable as den trees are a premium in our bottomland forest, because most of the big old trees over the course of time would have been considered coal trees and removed, cut down. Coarse woody debris is very important, but it's a little different in bottomland systems than in some of the other systems. In many systems, coarse woody debris remains where it occurs, whereas the impacts of flooding has a high potential to redistribute coarse woody material. You can have a substantial coarse woody material in one area one year, and flooding can move some or all of it to another spot. So perhaps it's a little more ephemeral in a specific location, but having an abundant occurrence of it across the site is certainly important. And in terms of implementation, we identify our desired stand structure. As you can see on this table, we've identified some factors that we desire, and we go out and do a basic inventory. We assess what we have on the ground. In this particular stand, I think this was from Cache River, canopy cover was 80%, and our target was somewhere between 60 and 70%. And the basal area was very high. It was 142 square feet per acre, and we were targeting a much lower basal area. And so we use basic inventory to identify areas that we should be working in addition to our landscape planning, and help inform the kinds of work that we're going to do. And from that, here's an example from Cache River. In this particular stand, we were looking to promote the desired forest conditions. In this stand, this was the year after we identified emerald ash borer on site, so we knew forest health was a concern, and we were going to aggressively treat a stand to see what might happen. And we also wanted to capture an increase in shade intolerant regeneration, things like oaks. And you can see on the graph on the left, pre-treatment, the dominant tree in this stand was green ash. 21% of the basal area was green ash. I'll also point out that shade intolerance like cottonwood and Nuttall oak, they are almost exclusively in the larger diameter size class. You see very, very little representation in smaller trees. They're disappearing from this system, from this stand, and they're going to be replaced by sugarberry and elm and red maple in the absence of a disturbance. And silviculture was that disturbance in this case. And post-treatment, you'll notice the composition. We expect to have the same species associated with these stands post-harvest as we do pre-harvest. We just rearrange the abundance of them some. And visually, from a traditional forestry stocking diagram on the right, the stand we were just referring to, 1306A, it's above the A line. The A line is a overstocked forest. It's a maximum stocking, 100% stocking. When you get above it, its forest is considered overstocked. We call this the zone of imminent mortality. When trees are here, they're dying from competitive processes. And our objective was to reduce this stand back down below the B line. The B line is considered a fully stocked forest where all of the usable space is occupied, but by a tree, but every tree is free to grow. So from a traditional stocking point, we're going to open the stand up substantially. We started off at a basal area of 123 square feet per acre, and we had a target of roughly 70 square feet per acre. We developed a marking guideline, what we want to remove. And in this particular stand, we were going to remove all of the saw timber ash. Recall that ash was an emergent issue. It's going to die. And so we made the decision to use that to help guide to make the operation a commercially viable operation so that we could do some of the other actions that we may need to do. You got to have enough volume to do a commercial timber sale, bottom line. We removed 66% of the cottonwood, the sugarberry, box elder, elm, and maple. Process, get out and market. We use variable retention harvest. There's a lot of different silvicultural practices that can benefit wildlife. In this case, we're using a variable retention harvest, which is, as the name implies, a variability on what we retain. Speed up quite a bit here. Visually, this is a variable retention harvest at Tensas River Refuge. You can see the variability within the treatment stand. Some areas, post-treatment on the right, we had very little activity, very little tree harvest. In other areas, we had a moderate amount of tree harvest, and there were places that we had substantial gaps. And we think that this variability is really key to providing good quality habitat that promotes structure and desired composition over the long term and retains critical elements for wildlife habitat within the forest. So what's it look like? First couple of years post-harvest, we see an abundance of grasses in full development, and we begin to see sprouts and seedlings from seed sources emerge. A lot of shade intolerant regeneration in the center picture. By years 4 to 7, we begin to see much more complexity, lots of understory, the development of some mid-story, and lots of vines, in this case, muscadine or grapevine. And first couple of years, we see positive responses from pollinators and seeds. When our treatment areas flood, the waterfowl response is tremendous. In years 4 to 7, this is when we would have great use by species like Swainson's warblers and lots of small mammals and small rabbits and even black bear. Louisiana black bear commonly use these thicker habitats like this. Of course, over time, they're going to grow out of suitable habitat, and that's when we would consider whether we need another treatment. Of course, nature happens. Mentioned the sugarberry decline in ash, and this is a stand where we intended to leave a basal area of about 65 or 70 square feet per acre, and after the additional mortality, it was relatively open. Somebody asked earlier about what we're going to do to replace ash or species that may fall out of the system. I think nature is going to decide a lot of that. last week at the Cache River, we were marking timber in these areas. You can see substantial sunlight. And in these stands, you can see a tremendous amount of oak and other shade intolerant regeneration beginning. We think that this is going to carry on for a short while, but likely will need additional sunlight, a treatment of some kind to help it emerge and eventually become dominant in the stand many years down the road. I think the one question over time is that as we lose species like ash, is there a commercially viable option? Is there enough biomass remaining, enough volume remaining for us to commercially treat some of these stands and still retain the composition, structure, and features that we want to for wildlife habitat? And that I don't know that we have a clear answer for. The markets continually change. So that'll be a challenge. About to wrap up here. Landscape planning again. A lot of the prior speakers talked about adaptation, assisted migration, and using things like the tree atlas to identify future forest composition and species that are well adapted to what we anticipate to be future conditions, and certainly the same for a bottomland forest. However, I'd also mention that one of the greatest opportunities is simply a nature-based climate solution, getting more trees on the ground and helping consume some of the carbon that we're releasing as a society. So we've got decision support tools to help us identify the areas most important to restore and reforest. When we do that, ideally, we would try to fix hydrology, plug ditches, and recontour the lands, as the picture on the left would show, before we put trees on the ground. If all we do is plant trees, then that's not restoring forest, but it is providing a basis for time to eventually restore the function. A couple take-home messages. We got to be forward focused on not just what once was, but what can be. Our future forests are going to look different from past forest, and wildlife forestry is, in fact, ecological forestry. Jeff?
Thanks, Haven. Yeah, that was awesome. So yeah, and you generated some great questions here. And again, if folks can stay around, hey, we'll keep Haven around for a few minutes to answer questions. And I apologize if folks have to go and can't stay for that. But thanks for a great presentation, Haven. I guess, something to start with, and again, there are some good questions here, but something that stood out. You were mentioning looking for commercially available species to replace sugarberry and commercially viable species. I just wanted to say that having worked for Fish and Wildlife Service for a long time, Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't care about whether we get any. We don't care about the revenues we receive from those forests, but we do need to meet desired future conditions, and that provides us a means to get that work done to meet those desired future conditions. And I know, so I just wanted to point that out.
To that point, we need to be setting the example of what wildlife friendly forestry is. Private lands dominate the southeastern landscapes, including bottomlands. And if we do not show strategies that are ecologically appropriate and economically viable, we're not going to have the broader effect across the landscape that we need to be having. And we don't consider the financial component of our management beyond, do we have the resources to make it happen? And that's really, really important. There is very little resources available for forest management in the service. If we can't do it at cost or below, it's not going to happen.
Okay, so it looks like, Gwyneth, do you have 2 minutes or no? You got to run. Looks like
I'm being called.
You're being called. Okay,
so
So there's some great questions here on, I was hoping Haven could respond on the ash impacts but we'll have to leave it till next time. And so Haven, thanks so much for a great presentation, and thanks to all the participants. I hope you got something out of the presentation. I certainly did.
Yeah.
Thanks to all, and please join us next time.